She was chained and numbered until he walked in. I didn't come to Forest Delta to save anyone, much less a naked alien woman with numbers painted across her skin like she was a crate of damaged parts on discount. But the universe has a weird sense of humor, and mine must have been showing that day because I ended up doing exactly that. And to this moment, I still don't know if it was bravery, stupidity, or just the world finally slapping me awake after 36 years of minding my own damn business and flying solo. The market was hot and reeked of rust, ozone, and unwashed ambition, with voices bouncing off metal walls like someone had opened a zoo full of salespeople and told them every second was a life-or-death negotiation. I had landed my ship, the Rust Bucket, in Dock 12B, mostly because it was the only bay that didn't charge extra for smelling like fried coolant, and I had a short shopping list in my head: 2 quantum regulators, a cryo-stabilizer core, and maybe a coffee that didn't taste like disappointment. What I found instead was a stage, barely a platform really, and 3 figures on it, 2 children, clutching each other like the floor might dissolve beneath them, and a woman, tall, pale, luminous in that strange way some species just are, but covered in streaks of dark numerals and dried ink, crouching in the shadow of her own silence, while people bid on her with the same tone I'd heard used for goats or entertainment drones that occasionally exploded when you fed them the wrong code. I stopped walking. My brain kept telling me this wasn't my problem. My heart apparently had other plans because the next thing I knew, my hand was up and my mouth was saying a number, a stupidly high one, enough that the auctioneer blinked, confirmed twice, and then grinned like he just sold me a piece of prime-grade tech instead of a breathing, terrified person. One handshake later, I was the proud new owner of one former language teacher, now classified as cargo with unresolved species registry, and 2 kids who couldn't have been older than 6 cycles and hadn't let go of her hand since I saw them. The auctioneer asked if I needed help transporting my purchase. I looked him dead in the eye and said yes. I needed clothes, 3 sets and maybe a blanket, and also someone to explain what kind of self-respecting interstellar market thought it was acceptable to sell people like they were scrap metal. He laughed. I didn't. The laughter stopped. We left with a crate of donated clothing and a growing number of people pretending not to watch us. Back at the Rust Bucket, I told them to stay near the engine bay where the heat lines ran strong and the lights flickered less, and I spent a solid hour scraping the last of the paint off her skin with a rag and solvent, while she sat completely still, watching me like a bomb waiting for someone to cut the wrong wire. She hadn't spoken. The kids hadn't either. They were too busy trying to vanish into the smallest corners of the ship, eyes wide, movements cautious, like any sudden noise might wake up a monster. I didn't blame them. If I were sold like luggage and handed off to a stranger who smelled like engine grease and sarcasm, I wouldn't be chatty either. I left them with a ration pack, a heating unit, and the vague assurance that no one was going to touch them unless they wanted a wrench to the face, then went to the cockpit and tried to figure out what the hell I had just done. It wasn't like me. I didn't save people. I fixed things, flew from place to place, did odd repair jobs, and smuggled parts through inconvenient borders. I didn't play hero, but her eyes had looked like language. Not a scream, not a plea, just something deep and aching and entirely aware. And somewhere in the back of my mind a switch had flipped, and now I had passengers. Refugees. Maybe dependents if the Union ever found out. I was halfway through arguing with myself when a sound stopped me. A gentle knock, followed by footsteps, and then the woman herself, now wearing a too big maintenance shirt and holding a small handheld slate, the kind traders use to write price haggles when their translators fail. She held it out to me. On it in perfect standard script was written, "My name is Cyril. The children are not mine, but I could not leave them." I wanted to say something cool, something comforting, maybe even something brave like "You're safe now." But what came out was, "Okay, well, the plumbing's bad, and if you hear the reactor hum on the low side, kick the panel near the shower. It settles the coils." She blinked once, then nodded. I pointed at the slate. That thing got a backlight, because I keep the cabin dim to save power. She wrote again. It does, thank you. I couldn't think of what to say next, so I said nothing, and she stood there still, like she didn't want to leave but didn't want to stay alone either. The kids were behind her, small, wide-eyed, wrapped in old blankets like makeshift armor. I asked, do they have names? She turned, touched each of their shoulders, and wrote slowly, deliberately. This is Rien. He is 5. This is Vel. She is 4. They lost their parents in the siege. They do not speak much. I crouched eye level with the kids and said, well, I'm Callan. This is my ship. It's loud, it's ugly, and it has more personality than a drunk pilot on karaoke night. You're welcome to stay here. You don't owe me anything. You don't have to be afraid. Vel nodded. Rien didn't, but he didn't flinch either. That was progress. I stood up, stretched, and said, I've got protein cubes, fake spaghetti, and something that might have been meat once, but we don't talk about that. Anyone hungry? Sarah looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. So we ate together, awkwardly, silently. A mechanic, an alien woman, and 2 frightened children who didn't know if this was another cage or the start of something else entirely. I didn't know either. I just knew I hadn't walked away, and maybe that meant something. Maybe not to the galaxy, but to them, to me. It was a start. Turns out when you accidentally buy a family at a flesh auction and bring them onto your creaky ship in the middle of a jurisdictionally vague trading system, your day gets complicated in ways you never bothered to prepare for, especially when you realize there's no manual for how to earn someone's trust after they've been stripped of everything, including the name on their back. The next morning, or at least what passed for morning according to my ship's internal clock, and a pot of synthetic coffee trying to kill me from the inside, I woke to find Cyril already up, the kids tucked back in a pile of cargo blankets, and the lounge area cleaner than it had been in months. Not just cleaner, but reorganized, like someone looked at the chaos of my bachelor spaceship lifestyle and decided quietly that entropy had gone on long enough. The emergency ration bins were now sorted by meal type and caloric density. The medkits were labeled in 3 languages, including hers. And somehow she had fixed the magnetic stabilizer on the galley drawer that had been stuck since the Jelari border run 6 months ago, which I had sworn to ignore out of principle, because the drawer had won and I respected that. I stared at the drawer like it had betrayed me and muttered, this is how civilization dies, in silence, under efficient hands. She was by the port window, scribbling something on her slate, humming a low, rhythmic tune that didn't match any database melody I knew, but it felt old, warm, like lullabies that don't ask for permission to settle into your bones. When I said good morning, she looked up and nodded, then tapped the slate and passed it to me. It read, we are grateful. I understand if this is temporary. I will help until we must leave. I replied by motioning toward the coffee pot and said, this is not a hotel. It's more like a flying mistake with engines. But if you're here, you're crew. That means you're not temporary. Not unless you want to be. She didn't smile, not exactly, but something in her shoulders eased, like maybe the crushing gravity of survival had let up for a second. Rien appeared next, hair sticking in 6 directions, looking like someone had tried to style him using static electricity and failed admirably. He sniffed at the protein bar I offered like it might leap at him. Then he ate it in 3 bites and asked if he could see the engine. I said yes because 1, I needed to inspect the backup fission relay anyway, and 2, letting a kid feel useful is better than letting a kid feel helpless. Vel followed, quieter, eyes scanning everything like she was drawing a map in her head. Her small hand clutched around a scrap of fabric that might have once been a doll. I took them both below deck, showed them the reactor's safe zone, the wrench sets, the emergency shutdown button labeled in red and 6 warning languages, and told them not to touch the coolant pipes unless they wanted to grow an extra toe. That got the smallest laugh from Rien, which I took as an unqualified win. Meanwhile, Cyril spent her time going over the ship's interface in silence, like she was learning it from context. No translator, just observation and intuition, which was impressive and also mildly terrifying because she picked up systems faster than half the mechanics I'd trained with. That night she passed me the slate again. You don't ask questions. Why? I looked at her, then the kids asleep in the corner, then back to her. Because what was done to you was wrong, but what you do next, that's yours. You're not a story I'm owed. You're a person. If you want to tell me, you will. Until then, I'll just fix stuff and pretend I'm a decent cook. She tilted her head, wrote something else, hesitated, erased it, then tried again. The numbers. I can't reach them. They are burned too deep. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I stood, walked to the medkit, pulled out the dermal laser, and returned. I held it up. It's not a miracle, but it'll work if you want. She nodded slowly. And so I erased them one stroke at a time, those awful numbers painted by people who saw her as less than a person, nothing more than a tag for inventory, a thing to be cataloged and sold. The process took hours. I didn't rush. I didn't talk. I let her breathe. Every number that disappeared felt like untying a knot that had been there too long, pressed too deep. When it was done, she stood and touched her shoulder, the skin smooth and unmarked, and though she didn't cry, her throat moved like someone swallowing gravity. Days passed. We fell into a rhythm, not quite a routine, more like the orbit of unfamiliar moons around a planet trying not to tip over. The kids began calling me Cal, which was either a nickname or a sign they were trying to claim some part of this strange place. I let them. I taught Rien how to calibrate a thrust vector. I taught Vel how to rewire a broken comms panel using a coat hanger and spite. Cyril taught me how to say thank you in her language, which I butchered so badly she actually laughed. A dry sound like wind through glass, but it was real. I didn't know what we were becoming, not exactly, but it wasn't temporary. Not anymore. Then the message came. It blinked onto the console without warning, encrypted but not well, marked with a tracking pulse I crushed with my thumb before it could ping back. The message was short. It read, "You have our property, return her or be declared fugitive." No coordinates, no signature, just the certainty of bureaucracy with guns. I stared at it. Then I deleted it. When Cyril saw me pacing, she wrote on her slate, "Is it them?" I nodded. She didn't ask what I would do. She just stood next to me, her hand close to mine but not touching, like contact was a choice she needed to make on her own terms, and I respected that. "We'll move," I said. "I know a guy on Vork Prime who can spoof ship IDs, and I can wipe the biometric logs on the station where I picked you up. We'll be ghosts." She didn't say thank you this time. She just wrote, "Why do this for us?" I thought about it. Thought about the way Rien had started humming when he worked. The way Vel had painted stars on the bulkhead near her sleep pod. The way Cyril still flinched when the ventilation coughed like a scream. "Because you shouldn't have to keep running," I said. "Because no one saved you before, so maybe someone should now." She didn't smile, but she looked at me like maybe, just maybe, she could believe that. We left orbit that night, the stars folding around us like a secret, the past still behind us but not chasing us. Not yet. I didn't know what came next. I just knew they were mine to protect now. Not because I owned them, but because I chose them. And for the first time in my life, someone chose to stay. Some names are whispered, others are screamed, but hers arrived like a thought you've always had yet never spoken aloud. And when she wrote it down for me the second time, I realized that names can still matter long after people try to erase them. Cyril. It was short, sharp, elegant, and sounded like it belonged to someone who had once stood in front of a room full of hopeful minds and taught them how to read the stars in 3 languages. She didn't say that exactly, not at first, but I pieced it together through fragments, things she etched into her slate with a stylus that looked far too soft for the truths she carved out of silence. It started when I asked what she did before. I had waited 2 weeks to ask. 2 weeks of engine hums and awkward breakfasts, and slowly learning each other's rhythms, until I felt like maybe she wouldn't recoil if I reached gently into the part of her that had once been more than prey. Her slate response was concise. I taught. When I asked what subject, she hesitated, then wrote language, history, philosophy, planetary ethos. It was the kind of resume that would make university boards cry with envy, and also the kind of life that collapses first when empires fall and soldiers stop distinguishing between teachers and rebels. She never told me what started the war, but from what I gathered, her homeworld had declared neutrality in a three-faction sector dispute, which in political terms meant everyone decided they were fair game. The first attack came with orbital fire. The second came with boots and chains. When I asked how she ended up on that auction platform, she simply wrote, "I stayed." I asked what that meant. She replied, "Others fled." I couldn't leave the children, I stayed. You may think that's a simple thing to say. It is. Staying behind when ships are evacuating and bombs are falling isn't noble. It's horrifying. It's surrendering any illusion of safety because someone smaller than you might not survive without your arms around them. She didn't get into specifics. She never listed the number of people she buried or the names of the homes she saw collapse. But I saw it in the way she winced whenever the ship's warning lights blinked red, or when the distant rumble of hyperspace felt too much like incoming artillery. PTSD looks different in every species, but the silence it leaves behind feels eerily the same. The kids didn't know the full story either, or if they did, they'd sealed it somewhere deep in the place kids put things they can't afford to process. Rien had started to speak again, mostly to ask questions about engines and gravity wells and whether or not plasma could melt your bones. Vel was still quiet, still alert, still drawing on the walls with a salvaged stylus and paper. Pictures of stars and strange plants and what I assumed were imaginary animals, but could very well be real creatures she once saw before they became extinct. One night after everyone was asleep, I sat in the cockpit going through old comm logs and shipment routes, planning our next jump, when I heard her footsteps, soft but certain, and turned to find Cyril standing there with her slate in hand. She passed it to me without a word. It read, "I need to tell you something." I gestured toward the empty co-pilot seat. She sat, legs crossed, hands resting on her knees like she'd done this before in another life. Then she began writing slowly, thoughtfully, like every word had to be lifted out of her soul before it could touch the screen. I was taken during the third month of the occupation. They raided the learning centers first, called us thought makers, said we were dangerous. I didn't fight. They took my students, I followed. They took me too. I spent 7 standard months in a detainment facility, then they sold me. The first buyer was a collector, wanted something rare. When I wouldn't perform, he returned me. The second buyer wanted a nursemaid for his hybrid offspring. I was assigned. They didn't survive long. I was returned again. The third simply wanted a body that didn't scream. I tried to fight back. I was punished. The next time I was placed in auction, they painted numbers on me so I would remember. I didn't, but they kept painting. I read the slate 3 times before responding, not because I didn't understand, but because I didn't trust myself to answer like a decent human being instead of a man who wanted to break things until the universe bled for letting this happen. I didn't say I was sorry. That would have been insulting. I didn't offer justice. That would have been dishonest. What I said was this: "You're not numbers, not paint, not cargo, not broken, not to me, not to them. You're not what they try to turn you into. You're still you." I saw her jaw tighten, not in pain, not in fear, but in the fragile act of belief trying to grow roots inside her chest. She wrote, "It is difficult to believe that." I said, "Then I'll believe it loud enough for both of us." That was the night she touched my hand without flinching, just a touch. But I swear it felt like a star collapsing into hope. After that, things changed in small, sharp ways. She stopped hesitating before entering the cockpit. She began humming again when cleaning, not constantly, just sometimes, like the ship's noise was no longer the only thing filling the void. One day, Rien came running into the engine bay shouting that Vel had drawn a picture of the whole crew. When I looked at it, I found stick-figure approximations of me, Cyril, the kids, and the ship with little smiley faces drawn on its thrusters. Above us she had scrawled something in their native script, and when I asked what it meant, Cyril translated it as our ship, our sky, our safe. That nearly broke me. Later, I asked her again about her name, not just the sound of it, but what it meant. She said it was an old name passed through generations of female scholars on her mother's side. It meant those who listen to the wind. I said, sounds like a poet. She shrugged and wrote maybe. Or maybe just someone stubborn enough to hear what others ignore. That felt accurate. She was stubborn, not in the loud way, but in the way that made you realize she'd rather die standing next to the right choice than live kneeling to a wrong one. And she listened. Not just to words, but to silences, to what people didn't say, to the way gravity settled differently when someone was afraid. Which is why, when I sat quietly that next morning watching the kids giggle over a breakfast made from nutrient paste and reconstituted berries, she wrote only this. You are becoming something new. I looked at her. What do you mean? She tapped her stylus gently. You're not what you were when you bought us. I think you're not sure what you are now, but you are trying to be better. That is rare. I chuckled. I still forget to filter the water tank. She tilted her head. Yes, you are very bad at that, but you care. That matters more. And that's when I realized she had begun to claim something for herself again. Her name, her space, her presence. Not because I gave it to her, but because she chose to. Not because she was owned, but because she remembered she never had to be. Her name was not for sale, not anymore. The thing about running a ship like the Rust Bucket is that it's less about piloting and more about negotiating terms with a stubborn old machine that only behaves because it thinks it's doing you a favor. And I've long since accepted that it's not the sleek kind of spacecraft you see in union recruitment ads or political thrillers. It's more like a floating apartment held together by repair tape, good intentions, and whatever sacrifices I make to the gods of inertia and redundant wiring, which is why when Cyril started reorganizing things without asking, I didn't stop her, partly because she clearly had an eye for efficiency, but mostly because I was kind of scared she'd outthink me in my own engine room. And yes, that happened once already when she rerouted a power relay to stabilize life support without needing my help. And no, I wasn't offended, just vaguely insulted by how easily she made my chaos look like a failed puzzle. Rien had declared himself my apprentice, which mostly meant he followed me around with wide eyes and too many questions while occasionally dropping tools in places where I'd find them with my feet, usually in the dark, usually with curses I regretted halfway through shouting. Vel was quieter but had taken to sketching things she saw on the ship, sometimes with unnerving accuracy, like the dent in the lower fuselage I hadn't told anyone about or the crack forming near the portside stabilizer coil, which meant I now had to fix problems not when they broke, but when the 5-year-old in the corner with a crayon predicted doom in the most adorable way possible. Cyril never claimed command of anything, but ended up taking over the galley, the logistics console, and the supply management system, and did it all with the silent authority of someone who didn't need to ask if she could help because she already knew she would do it better. And honestly, she was right, so I didn't argue. Which brings us to the current point of discussion, where I realized I was no longer the sole voice on this ship, and yet I didn't mind, not even a little. One morning, I came into the galley and found Rien teaching Vel how to calibrate the emergency beacon simulator, while Cyril prepared something that smelled like actual food instead of nutrient foam. And I said out loud to no one in particular, "This is getting weirdly domestic." And Cyril turned her head, not smiling, but her eyes crinkled at the edges like she was close, and said, "Good," which was the first word she'd ever spoken aloud since she came on board, and it hit me so hard I nearly dropped my mug. I didn't say anything about it then, just nodded and drank my coffee like hearing her voice hadn't just reprogrammed my entire emotional equilibrium. But later, when we were in the cargo hold doing inventory, I asked her why she chose that moment, and she shrugged like it didn't matter but wrote on her slate anyway, "I forgot to be afraid." That line stayed with me the whole rest of the day, through engine diagnostics and thruster tuning, and yelling at a stubborn oxygen regulator that kept whistling like a haunted teapot. Because for the first time I realized what I had given her wasn't just safety or food or shelter. It was the absence of fear, which is not the same as freedom, but is sometimes the first step toward it. That night I officially updated the ship's registry to include 3 passengers under pseudonyms. Not because I planned on turning them in, obviously, but because if we got boarded by patrol drones or scanned during dock, it helped to have something that looked legal on file. And I listed Cyril as technician support, Rien as engineering trainee, and Vel as moral support specialist, which is code for kid we like having around even if she steals my socks. A few cycles later we docked at Corin 9, a mid-tier trade station known for cheap parts, worse food, and a customs officer who owed me 2 favors and a punch to the jaw. And I told the crew to stay on board while I handled the exchange. Not because I didn't trust them, but because I didn't trust anyone else not to stare, ask questions, or decide that an alien woman with kids in a mechanic's jacket was a target instead of a person. Cyril disagreed, and not passively either. She marched into the cockpit while I was checking our manifest and wrote, "You cannot protect us by hiding us." And I said, "Yes, I can. It's called being responsible." And she replied with, "You said this ship is our home. Homes do not have hidden people." And I sighed the kind of sigh you make when you realize the person you care about is absolutely right and you still wish they weren't. So I relented. Under conditions, those being they stay within my sight and let me do all the talking. Rien wore my backup flight jacket and looked like a malfunctioning droid pilot. Vel wore a hat 3 sizes too big and insisted on bringing a stuffed lizard. Sarah walked like she had always been part of this universe, like she owned her own atoms again. And for the first time, I noticed how other people looked at her. Not with suspicion, but with curiosity and maybe a little wonder. Because even in a station full of smog and sweat, she moved like a cathedral in motion. We finished our supply run with minimal hassle, and only one vendor tried to flirt with Cyril. And yes, I might have broken a display stand by accident when that happened, which is probably unrelated. That night back on the ship, Rien asked if we were a crew now, and I said yes, and he asked if that made Cyril the captain, and before I could respond, Cyril said, "No," and I said, "Absolutely not." And we looked at each other and laughed in that quiet, startled way people do when something unexpected feels better than you thought it would. We celebrated with fake chocolate, which is like real chocolate but more emotionally disappointing, and the kids fell asleep in the main lounge, curled up like happy kittens. And I found myself standing next to Cyril as we looked out the viewport at the dull red light of a distant star, and I asked her if she ever missed it, whatever it was, her home, her world, her life before numbers. And she was quiet a long time before saying, "Sometimes I dream of rain." And I didn't know if that was literal or metaphorical or some combination, but it felt like the kind of thing you don't follow up on. Just sit beside in silence and keep company until it fades. Days turned to weeks. The ship got quieter in the best way, like the walls were beginning to hum a new rhythm. And then I found myself saying things like "we" and "our route" and bedtime. And when I caught myself, I didn't correct it because truth was I didn't feel alone anymore and I didn't want to. Cyril started calling me Cal, short for Callan, but also the same name the kids used, which felt like a small but sacred kind of belonging. One night she looked at me across the mess table and said, "You are better than you believe," and I replied, "That is a dangerously inaccurate statement." And she smiled, fully this time, and said, "But not untrue." And I realized that whatever we were becoming, it was real, and real was the only thing I'd ever wanted without knowing how to ask for it. The ship still broke down, the reactor still moaned, the autopilot still made navigation errors that required creative swearing, but we were steady, we were functional, we were something dangerously close to happy until the signal came. But that is for later. For now, we were just a crew with scars and silence and second chances, and I decided in that moment, with my feet on rusted floors and my hands full of coffee and chaos, that if anyone tried to take them from me again, they would have to go through the entire ship, and through me, because my ship had rules now, and rule number one was simple. This family stays. There's a rule in the universe that nobody teaches you, but everybody learns the hard way. That rule is this. The moment things start to feel good, the cosmos sends a reminder that it is absolutely not done messing with you. In our case, that reminder came in the form of a signal burst, piggybacking on a maintenance ping. It would have been routine, if not for the encryption layer so dense it made my comm system cough like it had swallowed a math textbook and hated the taste. I noticed it while we were docked at Hesperian 4, a tiny orbital station orbiting a gas giant with all the charm of a leaking airlock and about the same hospitality. We were there for parts and a food restock. The kind of trip where you keep your head down, your credits exact, and you definitely don't ask anyone what happened to the last guy who parked in Bay 7. That signal was Hesperian's standard traffic chatter. It had a signature embedded deep in the binary, one I'd seen before during an old smuggling contract, back when I still said yes to jobs that made me question my moral stability and spend nights wondering if I was one bad choice away from turning into the kind of person who got people like Cyril chained to auction blocks. I ran it through my ship's analyzer twice. I got the same result every time. It was a Hunter pulse, low frequency, targeted, directional, sent from a relay beacon parked outside legal space. That meant someone was looking for us. Specifically us. Not in the hey old friend, long time no see kind of way, but more in the wanted dead or returned, preferably unconscious variety. I didn't tell Cyril right away. Partly because I was still figuring out if I could spoof the return path and feed it garbage data. Mostly because she was laughing with the kids in the cargo bay, watching Rien try to balance a toolbox on his head, while Vel added more stickers to the side of the coolant intake. It hit me that I hadn't heard them laugh together like that before. Not once. Not that freely. Not that loudly. I couldn't bring myself to take it away just yet. So I closed the panel, smiled like nothing was wrong, and decided to lie to the universe just a little longer. We finished our resupply without issue, and jumped to low orbit around an uninhabited rock called Drexel's Scar, which sounded dramatic but mostly looked like a pockmarked asteroid shaped like a flattened potato. I chose it because nobody sane goes there. Sanity was exactly what I wanted to avoid if we were going to shake whoever had pinged us. We ran silent for 3 days. No broadcasts, no pings, no beacon flares. Just a ship drifting like debris among bigger pieces of debris. Even though it was boring as hell, the kind of boredom where you start talking to your tools and assigning personalities to your power converters, it was working. Or so I thought, until the long-range scanner picked up a shape moving too deliberately for random drift and too fast to be casual traffic. The moment I saw its burn signature, my stomach dropped. That engine profile belonged to a patrol-class frigate. There was only one faction I knew still using those relics, and they weren't exactly known for their friendly customer service. I cross-checked the ID tag. It was masked, but not well. There it was. Astralex Registry Band 943A. That might not mean much to you, but to me, and anyone else who ever ran a cargo job near black zones, it screamed corporate enforcement unit. Worse, not just any unit, but one that took contracts from the kind of clients who didn't want justice. They wanted silence. I knew immediately someone had sold our location. Maybe not intentionally. Maybe it was a trace left on a docking request or a credit transaction. It didn't matter. They were coming and they weren't here to ask nicely. I gathered everyone in the galley and told them the truth. All of it. From the signal to the tracking frigate to the likelihood that in less than 12 hours we'd have company with guns and legal documentation that treated Cyril and the kids as misplaced property. The room went still. Rien looked like he was ready to bite someone. Vel clutched her lizard doll until its stuffing peeked out the seams. Cyril didn't flinch. She didn't panic. She stood up calmly and said 4 words that changed everything. We should not run. I blinked trying to process that because running was the obvious option, the safe option, The one thing we were objectively good at. She shook her head and said it again, slower this time. We should not run. If we run now, we always run. They will chase us forever. If we hide, we teach the children fear. If we stand, we teach them worth. I stared at her. This woman who had spent months enduring things I couldn't fathom, who had walked away from hell with her spine intact and her mind sharpened into something unbreakable. In that moment, I realized she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was choosing who she wanted to be and, by extension, who we would become. I didn't agree right away. I argued. I paced. I shouted at the wall. Then I finally sat down and said, okay. But if we're going to stand, we're not doing it unarmed. We spent the next 10 hours turning the rust bucket into the most stubborn patchwork fortress this side of the outer ring. I rerouted shield capacitors, added false signature modules, primed the ventral plasma line for manual detonation, and armed 2 decoy drones with enough static feedback to fry every scanner in a 10-click radius. Cyril configured our navigation AI with evasive override. Rien helped build a jamming field. Vel painted angry faces on the nose cone. I told her it wouldn't help. She said it made her feel brave, and that was good enough for me. When the frigate arrived, it didn't hail us. It didn't broadcast. It just sat there, pulsing like a shark waiting for a wounded fish. When I activated the comms manually, a voice came through. Deep, cold, bored. The kind of voice that files your death under paperwork and calls it a day. Attention, unregistered vessel. You are harboring illegal property. Surrender the subjects for extraction, and no action will be taken against your crew. I leaned into the mic and said, this ship has no illegal property. The reply came fast and dry. Records show unauthorized acquisition of unclaimed assets during transfer window violation 87. You have 20 seconds to comply before removal is enforced. I muted the channel, turned to Cyril and said we've got maybe one shot before they lock weapons. She said, then make it count, and kissed me. Right there. In front of the kids and everything. I don't know if that was strategy or goodbye or something else entirely, but it lit a fire in my chest so hot I swear I smelled ozone. I hit the trigger. The drones launched, spitting static like confetti. Our signature scrambled. Our thrusters burst. The rust bucket danced through asteroid cover like it had something to prove. The frigate fired. It clipped our port wing but missed the core. I looped around, pushed engines past red, and cut hard beneath their firing arc. Then I flipped the plasma vent and sent a cascade of bright white hellfire into their face. Not enough to destroy them, but plenty to blind them long enough for our final jump vector to lock in. When we punched it, I felt the ship scream. But I didn't care. We were gone, a ghost again, safe for now. The kids cheered. Cyril squeezed my hand, and for one impossible second the universe forgot how to hurt us. But I knew better. I knew it was coming again. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next week, but this was only the beginning. Because the moment you stand instead of run, you stop being prey and start being dangerous. And the universe hates that, especially when the ones who stand are the ones it tried hardest to break. Flying is different from running, not just because you're using propulsion instead of panic, but because flying implies purpose, destination, control, and even if that's just an illusion, it's a good one. The kind of illusion that keeps you sane when the universe keeps trying to shove you into a corner and remind you that your place is beneath someone's boot. Which is why after we escaped the corporate frigate with smoke in our wake and reactor coils singing in protest, I didn't chart a course to the nearest hiding spot. I charted one straight into the heart of the unknown. A burn vector so erratic it would make pursuit ships choke on their own navigational systems. And I told the ship we weren't running anymore. We were flying. And it was time we started acting like a crew with a future, instead of survivors clinging to an airlock. And Cyril nodded like she had been waiting for me to say it since the day I first offered her a blanket instead of a leash. We limped our way to the edge of Union-registered space, threading through mining debris, comet tails, and the kind of gravitational anomalies that only show up in footnotes titled Do not enter unless you enjoy spaghettification. And all the while we upgraded the ship piece by piece, installing redundancies, patching welds, and swapping out old systems with whatever we could salvage from forgotten trade posts, ghosted relay stations, and one very generous asteroid colony, whose mayor owed me a favor after I fixed their atmospheric processor with duct tape and a spoon. Rien spent every waking hour in the engine room, soaking up knowledge like a sponge with opinions, asking questions about thermal converters, plasma dynamics, and whether or not you could weaponize the coffee machine, to which the answer was technically yes, but also never do that again. Vel began designing paint markings for the ship's hull, each one representing a day we survived, a planet we touched, or a new star she saw in a dream. And soon the rust bucket looked less like a scrapyard and more like a shrine built by people who refused to be erased. Cyril became our navigator, our comms specialist, our unofficial morale officer, and the voice that reminded us who we were becoming whenever we doubted the choices that brought us this far. And though she still didn't speak often, when she did, the words carried the weight of gravity and hope braided together like a kind of quiet magic that even the ship seemed to obey. One night, drifting near the event horizon of a collapsed moon, we sat in the galley, the lights dimmed, the kids asleep in their hammocks, and Cyril placed her hand over mine and said softly, "We are not what they said we were." And I replied, "No, we're better." And then, without ceremony, without expectation, she leaned in and kissed me, not like a goodbye or a thank you, but like a question answered, a wound acknowledged, a future accepted. From that moment forward, there were no more walls between us, no more polite boundaries wrapped in silence, just the slow unraveling of fear replaced by something neither of us had dared to believe in for a long time. I upgraded the flight deck, installed a secondary shield emitter, calibrated the inertial dampeners for tighter turns, and programmed an AI subroutine named Marvin who mostly complained about our flight patterns but never failed to calculate them accurately. Cyril found an old emergency transponder in a derelict station and rewired it into a signal scrambler that let us pass through patrol scans undetected. And for the first time in months, maybe years, we stopped looking over our shoulders and started looking forward. We plotted a route through the Caldor expanse, a trade-neutral corridor filled with independent worlds, smugglers, outcasts, and people who didn't care what you looked like, or where you came from as long as you could pay your docking fee and didn't bring drama, which sounded like our kind of crowd. We landed on a moon called Thessa's Reach, a dust ball with one functional city, 12 broken landing pads, and a market where you could buy anything from hypercrystals to vintage pre-collapse poetry etched onto magnetic slates. The locals didn't blink twice at Cyril or the kids, and for once, we didn't have to hide who we were. We sold an old grav core for enough credits to restock everything and then some. I got a real cup of coffee. The kids got handmade food that didn't glow. Cyril got new clothes that fit her and didn't belong to someone else's past. We even stayed 2 extra days just because no one told us not to, and when we left, Vel painted a sunburst on the ship's hull to remember it by. But the moment that truly changed everything came during a job we picked up 3 systems later, a repair contract on a malfunctioning data buoy orbiting a Class F dwarf star. Easy stuff, or so I thought, until we arrived and found the buoy hacked, overwritten with corporate surveillance code, and broadcasting classified traffic logs that listed Cyril by name and biometric profile, including her auction identification number, her capture date, and her current status listed as presumed rogue property pending reacquisition. I stared at the data so long I forgot to blink. Cyril said nothing. She didn't need to. I downloaded every byte, wiped the buoy, and then did something I hadn't done in years. I recorded a message, not just any message, a declaration. I sat in front of the comm console, activated the visual uplink, and said, "To anyone listening, my name is Callan Reich, pilot and captain of the ship Rust Bucket. Aboard this vessel are Cyril and 2 children known to your systems as unclaimed property. Let me be clear. They are not property. They are not numbers. They are not yours. They are mine, my crew, my family. And if you come after us again, I will not run. I will not hide. I will respond. Loudly. Permanently. You've been warned. Then I pinged that message through 6 relay chains, sent it to independent broadcast channels, uploaded it to trader forums, and attached it to every docking request we made for the next 30 days. I didn't care if they came. I wanted them to know that if they did, they wouldn't be the only ones with teeth. Sarah watched the message in silence, then said, "You are not the man I met on the platform." And I said, "Neither are you." And we both smiled because we understood what that meant. We were not afraid, not anymore. We didn't run, we flew. The funny thing about love is that you usually don't notice it when it arrives, because it doesn't walk in wearing armor or carrying flowers. It doesn't announce itself with fireworks or dramatic music. It just shows up one day disguised as a habit you don't want to break or a silence that finally feels like home. And by the time you realize it's there, it's already been living inside you for weeks, rearranging furniture and leaving quiet little notes in places you didn't know had meaning. And that's how it was with Cyril and me. Not a lightning bolt, not a sudden gasp, just a slow uncoiling of something fragile that had finally found room to breathe. It started small, as most real things do, like how she always left me the stronger cup of coffee even when she drank hers cold, or how she knew, when I was too tired to argue with the ship's AI, and just fixed the damn diagnostic herself, or how she never corrected me when I got the names of her people's constellations wrong. Just smiled that small amused way like I was the dumbest but most sincere creature in the room. I noticed how the kids started sitting closer to both of us at meals, how Rien began imitating my speech patterns when he got excited about fusion loops, how Vel started drawing pictures of the 4 of us, always together, always smiling, like she'd decided somewhere deep in her core that this was her family now, and the universe could either accept it or get out of her way. I remember the first time Cyril reached for my hand without hesitation. We were watching the nav screen cycle through potential trade routes, and my fingers were drumming a pattern on the console, and hers just settled over them like it was the most obvious thing in the galaxy. And I didn't say anything because I couldn't speak, not without sounding like someone who had just discovered the shape of peace and wasn't quite sure what to do with it. That night she fell asleep next to me in the cockpit chair, head against my shoulder, breath soft, and I didn't move for 3 hours because it felt like the entire ship would shatter if I disturbed that moment. Later that week, while repairing a faulty stabilizer panel, she asked me what I believed in. Not religion, not politics, just belief. It caught me off guard. I said I believed in duct tape, second chances, and the idea that sometimes the right thing doesn't feel heroic, just necessary. She didn't laugh. She nodded like I'd recited scripture. Then she said, "I believe in this ship." And I asked her why, and she said, "Because I am still alive on it." And that was the kind of answer that made you want to build a temple out of broken parts and swear loyalty to whoever gave it. We started sharing a bunk after that. No ceremony, no confession, just the simple act of not wanting to sleep apart anymore. It wasn't about bodies. It was about breath, heat, that strange safety that comes from knowing someone isn't watching over you because they are required to, but because they genuinely want to. We didn't use the word love at first. Too heavy, too soon, too terrifying. But we spoke around it, built scaffolding from it, designed a life shaped by its gravitational pull. I started calling her captain just to see her roll her eyes. She started calling me ridiculous every time I patched the hull with salvaged playground equipment because, hey, recycled polyalloy is still polyalloy. We joked, we fought, we apologized. We danced once to a song that came on randomly during a docking sequence, and neither of us admitted we had replayed it 5 times since. I taught her how to curse in 3 human dialects. She taught me how to pray in her language, which sounded less like supplication and more like an intimate conversation with the stars. Rien asked one day if we were married. I said no. Cyril said not yet. Vel asked what marriage was. I said it was when you decided that someone was your home and you signed paperwork so society would stop asking questions. Cyril said it was when you stopped wondering if you could trust someone and started wondering how you ever lived without them. The kids nodded like that made perfect sense. It did. One evening we were alone in the engine room, checking heat flow balance, which was absolutely an excuse to be alone for a while, and she looked at me and said, "You are kind to things that don't know they deserve kindness." And I replied, "You make me want to be someone who deserves to hear that." And then she kissed me slow, like we had all the time in the world, like time had been holding its breath for us to finally get here. Afterward, we didn't say anything. We just lay together on the warm floor panel, the hum of the reactor our lullaby, the knowledge of each other settling in like the universe had been waiting a long time for us to stop pretending we weren't in orbit around each other. There were still threats out there. Still bounty pings, still surveillance nodes broadcasting half-baked data trails about a rogue human and his allegedly stolen alien concubine, which I found both offensive and deeply inaccurate, not to mention wildly reductive of her career as a scholar and my impressive ability to rewire energy coils with a spoon and 3 curses. But for every whisper against us, there were now whispers in support. Smugglers we'd helped, outpost captains who owed us safe passage, refugee networks that began asking if we could take passengers. We said yes once, a family, 3 beings from a water world who had lost their ship and were being hunted for their gill enzymes. Cyril cared for them like she had for her own. The kids made them drawings. I fixed their hyperdrive. When they left, they called us family. The word was spreading, not fast, not loud, but steady. There was a ship out there, a ship that didn't run, a ship that flew, a ship that took in the broken and reminded them they were whole. One night, as we sat watching the stars stretch and dance along the edge of a hyperspace corridor, Cyril took my hand and pressed it to her heart. She said, "If you ask, I will say yes." And I looked at her, at the woman they tried to break and sell in silence, and I said, "I'm not asking because I need an answer. I'm asking because I want to say the words out loud," and then I did. "I love you." She smiled and said, "I love you too." And that was the moment I knew this wasn't survival anymore. This was living. And no matter how many patrol ships or bounty hunters or bureaucrats came after us, they were too late. They couldn't unmake this. They couldn't undo the family we had become. That thing they called love. We found it, and we built a home around it that no system could take away. There's a certain kind of stupidity that only bureaucracy can produce, the kind that folds logic in on itself like a badly written user agreement. And if there's one thing I've learned from trying to officially register 3 beings that a multiplanetary corporation still considers stolen property, it's that the law doesn't actually care about right or wrong. It cares about paperwork. And that's how I found myself in the docking lounge, of a mid-tier intersystem hub called Elrose Station, standing in front of a government terminal with a form titled Petition for Reclassification of Sentient Organic Assets blinking at me like a dare. And behind me, Cyril was trying not to visibly radiate contempt, while Rien and Vel sat on a bench poking at the station's free information kiosk, which was teaching them everything from galactic trade routes to how to recognize food poisoning in 6 alien species. And I thought, yep, this is fine. Just a normal day where I try to prove that the woman I love and the kids I'm raising aren't objects, while a machine asks me to input their storage location and projected depreciation rate. I wish I was joking. The system didn't even have a drop-down menu for former slave or rescued sentient or screw you, this is my family. Just options like biological cargo, labor lease, organic companion, or experimental specimen, which were all technically insulting and definitely enraging. And after 5 minutes of trying to find a loophole that didn't make me throw up in my mouth, I decided to do what any self-respecting starship captain would do in my place. I lied, not maliciously, strategically. I registered Cyril as a civilian contractor with a special license in cultural intelligence and multilingual interface optimization. I listed Rien as a certified engine assistant in training and Vel as a dependent under moral development observation, which sounded like nonsense but was vague enough to pass inspection. I paid the docking fee, submitted the forms, and uploaded a non-negotiable declaration of rights signed by me and notarized by a droid that owed me a favor from a card game involving magnets and regret. 2 hours later, I got flagged for review. Not denied, just flagged, which meant some underpaid junior analyst was now staring at our file wondering why a mechanic from the outer drift had suddenly decided to declare 3 alien refugees as part of his crew with full citizenship intentions. I could have waited it out, maybe bribed someone, maybe fled again, but instead I decided to take the direct route. I sent a message to the Galactic Union Legal Oversight Board. A real one, not a dummy ping. I told them everything, how I found Cyril and the kids, what they'd been through, how many systems still had their names listed as unclaimed assets. I attached pictures, not of the sale, not of the auction, of now, of Rien helping me fix the stabilizer coils, of Vel painting the wall with stars, of Cyril smiling while reading to both of them from an old data slate she had translated into 3 languages. And at the end of it I wrote, if this is illegal, then your laws are broken, and you should be ashamed. Then I hit send. I didn't tell Cyril right away, not because I wanted to hide it, but because I didn't know what she'd say. I expected fear. Maybe anger. Instead, when I finally told her, she looked at me and said, "You are reckless," and I replied, "That's not a denial," and she said, "No, it's not." That night we got a response, not from the legal board, from someone worse. Astronova, a high-level executive channel. No visual, just a text message. "We are aware of your transmission. You are now under formal observation. Do not attempt to further agitate political tensions. Your petition is under jurisdictional dispute. Any further action will be met with direct response." I stared at the message for a long time. Then I forwarded it to the legal board, to 5 major independent press outlets, to 2 pirate broadcasters, and to 1 anonymous whistleblower channel with a reputation for embarrassing the powerful. Then I wrote my own reply. Your threats are noted, so is your cowardice. If you want to silence me, you'll have to do it in front of the whole galaxy. Within 24 hours, our ship was trending on 7 systems. Not viral, not famous, just loud enough to get noticed. The captain who bought a slave and made her family. The kids who had no papers but drew constellations on the hull of a ship that ran from no one. The man who told a megacorp to get bent using proper grammar and a transmission delay. We got offers, interviews, invitations. I declined most of them. We weren't doing this for spectacle, but I said yes to one. A low-budget but well-respected journalist from the Independent Drift Network. Her name was Jessa Ty. She had a glass eye, a mechanical leg, and no patience for scripted stories. She came aboard the Rust Bucket, sat down in our galley, and said, "Tell me why this matters." I looked at Cyril. Then I said, because people like her shouldn't have to depend on people like me to be free, but sometimes we do and sometimes it works. The interview ran for 7 minutes, got replayed more than 300,000 times. We got flooded with messages, some hateful, most not. One message came from a judge, not a high court. A minor arbitration seat on a fringe planet with more sand than law, but still a judge. She sent a one-line note, "If you ever need a ruling, you'll have one." That was when Cyril kissed me in front of the kids with no hesitation, no fear, just certainty, and Rien said, "Gross," and Vel said, "Do it again." Our legal status didn't change overnight. The system was still broken. The flags were still active. But we weren't invisible anymore. We had names, we had faces, we had a voice. And as Cyril said that night as we watched the message feeds roll in, sometimes that is enough to begin. I nodded and said, "Beginning is my specialty," and she said, "Stubbornness is your specialty," and I said, "It's all part of the brand." We went to sleep that night with the ship drifting in low orbit over a quiet moon, no alarms, no pings, just the slow hum of family. Complicated, messy, illegal in 5 systems, and perfect. The funny thing about love is that you usually don't notice it when it arrives, because it doesn't walk in wearing armor or carrying flowers. It doesn't announce itself with fireworks or dramatic music. It just shows up one day disguised as a habit you don't want to break or a silence that finally feels like home. And by the time you realize it's there, it's already been living inside you for weeks, rearranging furniture and leaving quiet little notes in places you didn't know had meaning. And that's how it was with Cyril and me. Not a lightning bolt, not a sudden gasp, just a slow uncoiling of something fragile that had finally found room to breathe. It started small, as most real things do, like how she always left me the stronger cup of coffee even when she drank hers cold, or how she knew, when I was too tired to argue with the ship's AI, and just fixed the damn diagnostic herself. Or how she never corrected me when I got the names of her people's constellations wrong. Just smiled that small amused way like I was the dumbest but most sincere creature in the room. I noticed how the kids started sitting closer to both of us at meals, how Rien began imitating my speech patterns when he got excited about fusion loops, how Vel started drawing pictures of the 4 of us, always together, always smiling, like she'd decided somewhere deep in her core that this was her family now, and the universe could either accept it or get out of her way. I remember the first time Cyril reached for my hand without hesitation. We were watching the nav screen cycle through potential trade routes, and my fingers were drumming a pattern on the console, and hers just settled over them like it was the most obvious thing in the galaxy. And I didn't say anything because I couldn't speak, not without sounding like someone who had just discovered the shape of peace and wasn't quite sure what to do with it. That night she fell asleep next to me in the cockpit chair, head against my shoulder, breath soft, and I didn't move for 3 hours because it felt like the entire ship would shatter if I disturbed that moment. Later that week, while repairing a faulty stabilizer panel, she asked me what I believed in. Not religion, not politics, just belief. It caught me off guard. I said I believed in duct tape, second chances, and the idea that sometimes the right thing doesn't feel heroic, just necessary. She didn't laugh. She nodded like I'd recited scripture. Then she said, "I believe in this ship." And I asked her why, and she said, "Because I am still alive on it." And that was the kind of answer that made you want to build a temple out of broken parts and swear loyalty to whoever gave it. We started sharing a bunk after that. No ceremony, no confession, just the simple act of not wanting to sleep apart anymore. It wasn't about bodies. It was about breath, heat, that strange safety that comes from knowing someone isn't watching over you because they are required to, but because they genuinely want to. We didn't use the word love at first. Too heavy, too soon, too terrifying. But we spoke around it, built scaffolding from it, designed a life shaped by its gravitational pull. I started calling her captain just to see her roll her eyes. She started calling me ridiculous every time I patched the hull with salvaged playground equipment because, hey, recycled polyalloy is still polyalloy. We joked. We fought. We apologized. We danced once to a song that came on randomly during a docking sequence, and neither of us admitted we had replayed it 5 times since. I taught her how to curse in 3 human dialects. She taught me how to pray in her language, which sounded less like supplication and more like an intimate conversation with the stars. Rien asked one day if we were married. I said no. Cyril said not yet. Vel asked what marriage was. I said it was when you decided that someone was your home and you signed paperwork so society would stop asking questions. Cyril said it was when you stopped wondering if you could trust someone and started wondering how you ever lived without them. The kids nodded like that made perfect sense. It did. One evening we were alone in the engine room, checking heat flow balance, which was absolutely an excuse to be alone for a while, and she looked at me and said, "You are kind to things that don't know they deserve kindness." And I replied, "You make me want to be someone who deserves to hear that." And then she kissed me slow, like we had all the time in the world, like time had been holding its breath for us to finally get here. Afterward, we didn't say anything. We just lay together on the warm floor panel, the hum of the reactor our lullaby, the knowledge of each other settling in like the universe had been waiting a long time for us to stop pretending we weren't in orbit around each other. There were still threats out there. Still bounty pings, still surveillance nodes broadcasting half-baked data trails about a rogue human and his allegedly stolen alien concubine, which I found both offensive and deeply inaccurate, not to mention wildly reductive of her career as a scholar and my impressive ability to rewire energy coils with a spoon and 3 curses. But for every whisper against us, there were now whispers in support. Smugglers we'd helped, outpost captains who owed us safe passage, refugee networks that began asking if we could take passengers. We said yes once, a family, 3 beings from a water world who had lost their ship and were being hunted for their gill enzymes. Cyril cared for them like she had for her own. The kids made them drawings. I fixed their hyperdrive. When they left, they called us family. The word was spreading, not fast, not loud, but steady. There was a ship out there, a ship that didn't run, a ship that flew, a ship that took in the broken and reminded them they were whole. One night, as we sat watching the stars stretch and dance along the edge of a hyperspace corridor, Cyril took my hand and pressed it to her heart. She said, "If you ask, I will say yes." And I looked at her, at the woman they tried to break and sell in silence, and I said, "I'm not asking because I need an answer. I'm asking because I want to say the words out loud," and then I did. "I love you." She smiled and said, "I love you too." And that was the moment I knew this wasn't survival anymore. This was living. And no matter how many patrol ships or bounty hunters or bureaucrats came after us, they were too late. They couldn't unmake this. They couldn't undo the family we had become. That thing they called love. We found it, and we built a home around it that no system could take away. There's a moment in every fugitive's life when you stop looking over your shoulder, not because the danger is gone, but because you finally understand that fear is just another form of permission. We had decided, without ceremony or consensus, that we were done giving permission to a system that had already tried to erase us. So when the third surveillance drone in 2 weeks drifted past our ship without even trying to cloak itself, I didn't flinch. I waved at it. I even offered it a diagnostics patch to help fix its failing solar rotors, because if the corporations wanted to keep watching us, they might as well get a good show. The truth was, they weren't trying to catch us anymore. Not really. We were too loud, too visible, too connected to the growing network of voices saying maybe people shouldn't be bought. And maybe families aren't defined by blood or borders or biometric tags. They couldn't make us disappear without attracting more attention. And attention was the one thing they hated more than failure. We had stopped running, and they knew it, which meant they had to get creative, which is always a bad sign. The first sign of their creativity was a lawsuit. Not a normal one, but a jurisdictional preemptive injunction, claiming that my guardianship over Rien and Vel constituted unlawful custodial conversion, and that Cyril's presence aboard the Rust Bucket represented breach of interstellar property retention statutes. It was legal nonsense, written by someone who probably had their soul stored in a vault, but still dangerous enough that we had to respond officially. So I did. I hired a lawyer, or more accurately, I hired a woman named Trya, who used to be a lawyer before she realized she could make more money suing people who tried to serve her papers. She was sarcastic, had 4 cybernetic fingers, and wore a jacket made of expired ID tags. When she came aboard, she looked at our file for 10 minutes, laughed for 5, and then said, "Yeah, this is going to be fun." Her strategy was simple. Fight them in the open, use their own systems, drown them in paperwork until they couldn't see straight, and then, when they started choking on their own process, force a public arbitration that we would absolutely win. I asked her how she was so sure we'd win, and she said, "Because people like me are sick of people like them. And when you make a case public enough, it stops being about legality and starts being about optics. The corporations don't do well under light." While Trya prepared our case, we kept flying, not to hide, but to visit. We stopped at stations where Cyril taught classes to refugees. We visited old mining outposts where Rien helped install power regulators, and Vel drew murals on supply lockers. We became known, not as fugitives, but as a floating crew of misfits who helped where they could and asked for nothing in return. We received food, fuel, and in one case, a refurbished drone gifted by a retired data courier who said we reminded her of herself, back when she still believed in hope. One night, while in orbit above a garden world recovering from a recent drought, Cyril and I stood on the hull of the ship in vacuum suits, watching the planet's new cloud systems pulse with artificial weather. And she said, "I never thought I'd live to see rain again." I said, "Me neither." And then she added, "But I'm glad it's with you." The kids started calling me Dad. Not all the time, not formally, but in those casual ways that catch you off guard. Like when Rien handed me a tool and said, "Here, Dad," or when Vel tripped during a station landing and yelled, "Dad," before I even had time to catch her. Each time I froze for a second, like my body had to recalibrate for the size of the word, and then I'd nod and pretend it was the most natural thing in the world. We made friends, allies. A trade captain named Marn, who smuggled art supplies for Vel. A medic named Kalo, who taught Cyril advanced biosign monitoring. An old weapon technician named They say the past is written in scars and numbers, but I never liked that idea. Because scars are reminders and numbers are labels, and neither of them tell you who someone is, only what someone else did to them. And Cyril understood that better than anyone I've ever known. Because for a long time her body had carried numbers, not memories, numbers that someone else decided defined her value, her status, her legality. Numbers that said she could be bought and sold and discarded. And for months after we met, I would still see her touch the place on her shoulder where the worst one had been, like she could still feel the ink burning under her skin, even though I had erased it with my own hands, in silence, under the hum of our old med scanner. And I remember the way she had closed her eyes as I finished the last stroke, not with relief, but with quiet disbelief, as if a part of her had never truly believed those numbers could come off. Now they were gone, not just from her skin, but from the systems, the registries, the bounty databases, and the corporate archives that had once treated her as inventory. Because when the court ruling came down and her name was declared legally sovereign and independent, I watched her stand a little taller, breathe a little easier, and walk with a weight finally gone. And no one said anything about the numbers again, not even the kids, who had once traced them with fearful fingers, as if learning to read a code that decided whether their mother would be taken again. But healing is not about forgetting. Healing is about choosing what stays and what goes. And Cyril chose what stayed. She chose her name. She chose her voice. She chose to teach again, first on small outposts, then on larger stations, then across broadcast networks, where her lessons in language and ethics and interspecies empathy were streamed to a growing audience who saw not a refugee, but a leader. She never spoke about her past unless someone asked, and even then she didn't dwell. She always said the same thing: "That was the beginning of me, not the end." As for me, I kept flying, not away from anything, just toward whatever came next. The rust bucket stayed patched and patched again, old but proud. A ship that had once been a hiding place and was now a flag. Rien grew fast, started designing things I couldn't even understand, and got accepted into a mechanics academy on Valter Station, not because of his grades, but because he reverse-engineered their entire entrance software and sent them an improved version of their firewall. Vel kept drawing. Her latest mural was a scene of us all, standing together on a cliff, overlooking a new world, stars above our heads and light in our hands. She called it Arrival. I didn't cry, but only because I was too proud to let the tears win. One morning I found Cyril standing by the viewport, holding a small piece of cloth wrapped around something hard. She unwrapped it and showed me a tag, a tiny metal tag with a barcode and an old auction number scratched into the surface. I stared at it and asked where she got it. She said she had kept one, not as a memento, as proof that it had existed, that she had survived it. Then she handed it to me and said, "Burn it." I took it without a word, walked to the furnace core and fed it into the plasma line. It vanished in a flash of heat and light, and when I turned back, she was already smiling. That night, we held each other in the dark, not because we needed warmth or comfort, but because that's what you do when you love someone and the world has tried to make you forget how to love. You hold them. You stay. You breathe together. We got a message a week later from a colony in the outer systems, asking if we could come help build their education network. Not repair, not fight, build. Cyril said yes before I even asked. Rien said he could install the comms. Vel said she would paint the school. I just said, all right, and smiled. As we prepped for departure, I looked around our ship and saw something I hadn't expected: peace. Not silence, not safety, peace. Earned, lived in, shared. Cyril came up beside me and whispered, "Do you remember the first thing I wrote to you?" And I said, "Yes, you wrote, 'My name is Cyril, the children are not mine, but I could not leave them.'" And she said, "You never asked me why I stayed with them even when I had the chance to leave." And I said, "I didn't need to know." And she said, "The truth is, I stayed with them because I wanted to become someone who would never leave them again. And you gave me that chance." I didn't reply right away. I just took her hand, kissed her knuckles, and said, "Thank you for staying with me too." The engines came online with their usual cough and roar, and the kids shouted from the corridor that the nav computer was already set. And Cyril laughed and said, "Then what are we waiting for?" And I said, "Nothing. Not anymore." As the stars stretched out before us and the ship surged forward, I looked back one last time at the trail we'd left behind. Not smoke, not damage, just light. And I thought to myself, this was always the story. Not the escape, not the rescue, not the defiance, but the fact that through it all, through the numbers, the fear, the broken systems, and the impossible odds, we found each other and made a life anyway. The numbers were never hers. The name was. And now the future would be too.